Hey team, before we dive into today's episode, I've got a quick favour to ask. The Women's Football Hub merch store is now live, and every purchase helps support our work as a non-profit championing women and girls football from the ground up. There's something for everybody, adults and kids. There's loads of colours and sizes, and your support helps us grow the game one piece of apparel at a time. Just head over to www.womensfootballhub.com to check it out. Thanks for backing the hub, and now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome to Women's Football Hub. I am your host for this episode. I am Carolyn Kent, and today we're discussing 10 years of concussion guidance in grassroots sport. And who better to bring along than a woman who has a master's in neuropsychology and a PhD specialising in sport-related concussions. She is, of course, the wonderful Dr. Stephanie Adams.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Good to be here.
It's lovely to have you. Now, I want to start by chatting about your company that you founded, concussED. So let's chat about that first of all, and obviously how you came to being the founder of that company.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. So I suppose that setting up concussED really was a culmination of years of research off the back of my PhD and postdoc work, which was really trying to understand how can we better educate folk around this topic so that it improves their attitudes and behaviors, because that's the hard part, isn't it? So I know there's been decades of work in terms of improving general awareness, but I got really interested in terms of that sustained attitude and behavior change. And honestly, it was just a natural progression, as I say, off the back of my PhD. I really enjoy providing concussion education to various groups and saw it as a mechanism to, I guess, increase the impact that comes out of PhDs. So it's really been a labor of love and something that I've been doing for now a decade, I suppose, building that skill set in terms of education when it comes to concussion.
And what was it that kind of made you go, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do a PhD in concussion.
Do you know what? A few folk have asked me that over the years, and I can't pinpoint the exact moment, but as you mentioned in the introduction, I did a PhD or a master's initially in neuropsychology. And I did do a project there in concussion looking at the effects of concussion on executive function, so things like decision making. And it reminded me, actually, Stephanie, you've had a concussion in the past. At that point, I hadn't gone into it because of my personal experience, but just through having an opportunity to do a master's project, realized that I genuinely enjoy learning about this topic. It's such an important topic, and saw an opportunity to knock on a few doors at University of Edinburgh and ultimately sort of create a project. And initially thought we might focus the project in rugby, but long story short, ended up doing most of that research with motorsport drivers and then subsequently some side stuff around with PE teachers. And so it just goes to show, if you allow things to unfold and follow your interest, I guess, in research, you never know what might come.
And what was it that made you kind of look at motorsport drivers in particular with regards to concussion? Because obviously they will be subject to immense G forces. So
Yes.
what was it that made you kind of go into that?
Yeah. So, I mean, all credit goes to my PhD supervisors, who were both a psychologist and, to be honest, we're already working with that population through, at the time, what was known as the Young Driver Development Program in the UK. And so they were actively working with a group, and I think I must give them credit, I think they had a light bulb moment going, actually, you're interested in concussion. We're already working with this group. Let's have a chat with the folks at the medical team at Silverstone, like Professor Hutchinson, who ended up being a third supervisor. And it was just one of those opportunities where we realized there's a need. No one has looked certainly in a UK context at the time, no one had looked at, what's the base knowledge and understanding in sort of the lower level, as well as the elites, so rally driver and things like that. So we scoped that out. And from there had, I guess, the evidence to say, let's build a concussion education pilot.
Nice. And of course, you are landed obviously in Scotland, and Scotland, with regards to concussion protocols, is actually led, especially in football, which is what we're going to talk about today. It's now 10 years since the original sort of Scottish Sports Concussion Guidance was launched. What's kind of been your involvement with that, and what kind of prompted that being needed in the first place?
Yeah, so in terms of my involvement, so I am, as you can probably hear, I'm not originally from Scotland. I am Canadian, New Scotland though, so there's a nice link there. So Nova Scotia is New Scotland. But I moved here in 2014, and obviously in the background, there was, the very tragic, unfortunate passing of Benjamin Robinson, and we know likes of his father and mother, and researchers such as Willie Stewart and medics in Scotland, such as James Robson, and a host of other professionals had really come together. And I think, that tragic event led to, we need to be doing something in terms of guidance and raising awareness. Whilst I had just arrived on the scene, this wonderful group of passionate, like-minded people, I think, ultimately started to forge that work and speak at various events across the UK. And that energy and commitment to doing what was needed at the time led to this first of its kind grassroots guidance for all sport. And that was officially launched in 2015, as you said, in terms of its first iteration.
It's interesting that you bring up that case, actually, Benjamin, because that was actually mentioned at the emergency sports medicine course that I was doing a few weeks ago. And it was interesting because they reminded all the healthcare professionals in the room who are doing anything on pitch side that the Maddox questions are not as important as you think they might be, because I believe in that case he actually passed the Maddox questions, I
Yeah.
think, twice. So yeah, and I think it was just, I think there always needs to be learning from any sort of tragedy like that, and
Mhm.
and I think it was good to see that they are reminding all the healthcare professionals you cannot rely on that element of your concussion tests.
Exactly. Absolutely.
From your perspective, right? Obviously, we've got these kind of guidance now, and it's now all sports because it's right through the entire grassroots. What was the level of awareness and understanding of concussion in grassroots football? Are
Mhm.
you noticing it's getting better, or was it particularly poor at any point?
A really good question. And obviously, I can only speak to my experience sort of over the last, was it 11 or so years. But I think my observations upon coming to the UK and starting to work with, populations such as amateur, particularly university level, maybe a little bit lower in terms of the link to football, or PE as well, was that across the board there was an opportunity to increase awareness. So I always use this example of one of a very basic activity that we sometimes do in some of the education is obviously covering sign and symptom knowledge, and that can be done in various ways, but we tend to approach that through an interactive bit of a competition. Might be like a sorting task where folks simply need to put a pile of signs and symptoms in true or false category. When we first started doing this 10, 11 years ago, I'd be going around the room correcting the majority of them, right? So making lots of corrections, loads of folk being really surprised by things like the sleep related or emotional signs and symptoms, as an example. Nowadays, if I do that activity in a session, sometimes I'm not correcting any in groups, and others maybe I'm correcting just of a couple. So I think in that decade, we have seen a surge, a pocket in various settings, including football, of basic sign and symptom knowledge improving. Now, that's obviously only one part of guidance and awareness, but I think just the fact that I'm seeing that trend anecdotally and through some of the work I'm doing, it's showing that the messaging is starting to get out there, that we're starting to cover some of the basics in terms of signs and symptom knowledge.
That's the thing, isn't it? And everyone talks about, oh, well, we need more education. But even when you've got the education out there, sometimes that still doesn't change behavior.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it's one of the biggest things that I think I've learned with this project is that there's a lot of education already out there for free on the internet,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean that somebody's going to change the behavior. And I suppose the classic one with that is if we could do that, if we could just educate and then the behavior kind of changed, smoking
Yeah.
would have ceased. It ceased a long time ago. Those little pictures on the
Yeah.
outside of those packets, we wouldn't be doing that anymore.
Yeah.
But what are the more significant changes? Because obviously it's been an update. So what are
Mhm.
the more significant changes in the 2024 version of the guidance compared to the earlier ones?
Yeah, great question. So there's a few key ones I suppose to highlight. And one of them is that the guidance is now the same for all. So previous iterations, there was a slight difference in terms of if you were youth or adolescent versus an adult, as an example. Now we use the same for everybody. Okay. Now, children and adolescents might take a little bit longer to work through what's known as the graduated return to activity and sport program. So they might take a bit longer to work through that. But as a principle, we don't need to, put them in a box and keep them at each stage for that. And it's sort of, there's this idea that every concussion is unique, every individual is unique at a high level. This general approach for everybody works, with the caveat that each person might take a bit longer. Someone might stay at a certain stage for several days. Someone might be there for 2. It sort of gives that level of ability to respond to how that person's signs and symptoms and how they feel in themselves in that moment with their particular context, if that makes sense.
So, and am I right in thinking that across all sports, it's the same?
Yes. Yeah. So across all grassroots sports, it's the same.
And is that just Scotland, or does it go right across the entire UK?
Yeah, great question. So there is now that process is adopted now UK wide, which is great. I think that consistency is really helpful, important. So, sort of singing from the same hymn sheet, as we say, in terms of just having that level of standard care, and hopefully helps when folk are talking about it with each other. There's hopefully less room for misinterpretation. So that's definitely one of the key updates. Another update that might surprise folk is actually that we now know that staying in a dark room until your symptoms disappears is absolutely not the way to go. In fact, that can make things worse. And what the current evidence is showing, that once we've done what's known as a relative rest period, so this is your first 24 to 48 hours of the concussion, once you've had rest physically and cognitively, that's really important. We do want to introduce a little bit of movement. So light things around the house, short walks, and slowly building up the tolerance to exercise. And if folk want to check out that GRASS program I mentioned, they'll see how it sort of builds that tolerance before ultimately at grassroots level returning to sport no sooner than 21 days. So sports competition no sooner than 21 days. So I think that's positive. Sort of getting people moving, but not pushing them too fast too soon is also really key.
And that's a key point, isn't it? There's no return to competition before 21 days, but that doesn't mean you do nothing before 21 days, right? So that's probably a key thing. Now, talking about recognizing and responding to concussion for any sort of coaches, parents, and players that are listening, what are the key signs and symptoms of concussion, which gratefully we're seeing that people are becoming more aware of? But what would be some of the key signs and symptoms that you would say, yeah, you definitely need to look out for those?
So I like to always think about this as in terms of the 4 main areas. So we've got your physical signs and symptoms. These are often the ones we sort of pick up through general life over time, the things like the nausea, the vomiting, the headache, dizziness. And there's also what we call cognitive or mental signs and symptoms. So these are things like someone saying like, they just feel a little bit out of it, or feeling in a fog, feeling slowed down, trouble remembering, trouble concentrating. But there's also sleep related ones. So this could be either having trouble falling asleep or having trouble staying awake. So it can go one of the other ways. And the fourth category is one that I think base understanding, again, is getting better here. But the fourth category that folk might not yet be aware of is sort of this emotional related area. So it might look like someone feeling, a lot more angry than is normal for them, or more irritable or emotional, breaking. I've heard of stories of, just back to the motorsport for a moment. I appreciate we're on football.
That's okay. That's all right.
For motorsport for a moment, I've heard of cases where a driver, exhibited maybe a little bit of a headache, but their main symptom was more in that emotional category. So there's different areas that can be affected, as you can imagine. And I think that makes sense when you start to think about the fact that different parts of the brain do different things. So if different parts of the brain receive a lot of that force from the injury, that might help to be a bit of a puzzle piece with what's going on.
It is interesting because I have to say that sort of anger and emotional one I always found really difficult, because and obviously I'm working at a different level to the grassroots, but when you tell a player that they're going to have to come off because you think they have a concussion, they can get quite aggressive and angry. And your question is, well, is that you, me taking you off, or is that the concussion? And I always say concussion is one of the hardest things from a practitioner point to make that judgment call. And then, of course, Scotland helped us out, didn't they? Because they said, if in doubt, set them out, right?
Mhm.
And have you seen a kind of increased uptake because of that campaign?
Yeah, I think then I've got the mug here, as you say, if in doubt, sit them out. I think that mantra, for lack of a better way to put it, I think is one easy to remember, but also it defines the first step, right? So it tells us if we're not sure what to do, we take someone out. And I definitely think increasingly we're seeing a wave of people knowing about that, following through on that. And it's a slow culture change, which comes with all the education and the guidance disseminations that's happening. So definitely starting to see more of an uptake.
Well, that's it. And, when I'm dealing with students who are talking about concussion and how to deal with it, I always say, listen, if they've been knocked out, that's really easy. Like, they're
Yeah.
coming off. Like, but
Yeah.
it's the ones that you maybe missed the incident, you're not sure what's happened. And yeah, I remember speaking to some couple of weeks ago, a few really experienced doctors who said, look, sometimes we overcall it,
Mm.
and we make no apologies for it. And that was really
Yeah.
reassuring for me to think, do you know what? Yeah, actually, if I overcall it, that's fine. I say, look, the guidance is, if in doubt, set them out. Now, obviously, there can be some red flag symptoms with regards to concussion.
Yeah.
What would they sort of be, things to look out for if there's a kind of parent on the sideline where somebody's showing potential signs of concussion? What would be the red flag things that you go, do you know what? Hospital.
Yes, yeah. So red flags, as you sort of mentioned there, red flags mean seek urgent medical attention. Okay. And so if someone were to see things like the loss of consciousness, increasing confusion, increasing vomiting, increasing headache, sort of complaint pressure of the head, or coming in and out of consciousness as well. So in addition to just pure loss of consciousness. And sometimes, neck pain. So someone complain of neck pain is another example. And so these are, as you say, yeah, there's a list of red flags that mean you seek urgent medical attention that is slightly different in terms of what you do compared to the more general list of signs and symptoms.
And your advice for sort of kind of non-medical personnel, because as I've said, I find these difficult as a trained professional to
Yeah.
sometimes deal with and sometimes kind of sort through at times. What can non-medical personnel, volunteers, teachers, parents who are maybe on the sideline of a grassroots kind of club, what can they do to best respond to a suspected concussion?
I think the first and foremost is leaning on the guidance, leaning on the if in doubt, set them out. If they have any suspicion and something doesn't feel right, listen to that. Um, it's so much better to err on the side of caution and to link back to what the doctors mentioned to you a couple of weeks ago, to sort of overcall it. We only get one brain. If you're concerned and you've seen a potential incident or something's not right, take them off. And I think hopefully what's a helpful tool is in this latest guidance update, there is a section that sort of outlines a couple points. If you're a coach or a teacher, if you're an athlete, if you're a parent, there's within each of those categories, there's about half a dozen points of things that people might want to consider. And as you can imagine, it differs depending on your role. But the key, I think, summary for everybody is that if in doubt, sit them out. If you have any suspicion, take that person out, make sure that they're out of harm's way and that they're advised to seek either on-site medical attention if there's in a position that there is. But as we know at Grassroots, there's often not healthcare professionals on site. So in that case, the guidance recommendation is that they either seek attention from the healthcare professional in another setting or call NHS 111 within 24 hours.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because it can be tricky as well. And a lot of children want to be children, don't they? They want to
Yeah.
they want to play, and even when you come up a little bit through the adolescence sort of kind of route, they also look, I just want to play. And I think sometimes it's understanding that guidance is there for a reason. Now, you've obviously touched on the GRASS program, or the Graduated Return to Activity and Sport program, is its full title. Can you just explain a little bit about that and kind of how it works?
Yeah. So at a very high level, the way to think about the grass is this stepwise progression back to activity and sport. And the activity part is both education, so getting back to school, or work, because I think, historically in the past, we've maybe focused a lot on the sport part, but it's really important to remind ourselves that that concussion is a concussion and the concussion is going wherever that person goes. If someone's in university or school, although they're not being physically active, the screen time, the lights, all the sensory information, the different functions that are required of them are not dissimilar. Just back in terms of how it works, there's 6 steps, and that first step is this relative rest period. So 24 to 48 hours of rest. And in that time, folk really want to focus on reducing physical and cognitive load. So sounds really challenging, but things like reducing all screen time, right? So phones away if you can, TV away if you can. The more we can do that in the first 24 to 48 hours when there's this like heightened energy crisis, for lack of a better way of describing it, in the brain, hopefully better we're setting ourselves up for recovery. And then once you've completed that rest period, it's about gradually rebuilding ourselves back to both sort of education work, so maybe part-time return to different activities, or chunking information if we're studying into small bits of time. And then on the physical side of things, building ourselves back up through different staged activities. And for folk, if they're like, oh, what are those staged activities? If they want to just search that guidance, there's a few high-level examples that they could use with groups that they're working with as well. So it's really this staged process that ends at that final stage, is, as we said, sort of that sports competition stage, no sooner than 21 days from the concussion.
Now, this is the interesting part, right? Because you've got 21 days to return to sport. Is that right?
Yes.
You're right.
Yeah.
So no return to sport before 21 days. But what happens when the kid comes and say, "Oh, but it's just PE"? Well, because there's what is competition, what is training. Can you just and I know that sometimes this is difficult as well. Like, what would you define as that is returning to sport? What absolutely must be after 21 days?
So essentially, once you get, so there's 6 stages, and it's only towards sort of the 5th stage that you would introduce a scenario whereby there could be risk of head impact, I guess is really key. So that's another one to note for folk looking at that table, is thinking, is there risk of head impact? Could there be a potential concussion as well? So typically, if there's more commotion going on, there could be a potential. So it might not necessarily be contact training or some things where there's risk of that, but it's really only towards that tail end where someone would want to be in an environment where there's a potential risk of head impact. And before that, it's about trying to find ways of adapting the scenario where someone, back to your question around the PE, when we work with PE teachers, we have to try and think about, are there tiny tweaks in their lesson plan that they could enable that person to participate if lights, noise aren't bothering them, all that good stuff, still be part of the lesson, but maybe they have a different role in the lesson. Maybe they're the teaching assistant for a week. There's something else, so that they're included and they're being supported in a different way and not excluded. Just sitting on the bench, we don't want to reduce that. If they can participate in a different way that doesn't bring on symptoms, that's the key. Then I think that's really important to think about.
Yeah, it's finding that balance, isn't it? But also staying within the guidance. Now, obviously, a lot of young kids and adolescents, they might follow professional football.
Yeah.
Now, they have a very different return to sport pathway and protocol. So how different, obviously, because a lot of professional football players can be back within 7 days or just over 7 days. How does that differ?
I think that, as you're right, it is a challenge. And I think it's important to remember that in those situations, there's a multidisciplinary team behind the scenes that hopefully know that player really well. They know they're normal. They've maybe been tested on different things and they have data on that person hopefully before the concussion. So they have things to compare to. And at a grassroots level, that's unlikely the case, right? So we can't compare the data in the same way. And ultimately, without that, we want to be erring on the side of caution. And what the science is showing, that actually signs and symptoms often take longer than we might think. Typically, that's following, in line with that sort of 3 to 4 week period that things are happening deep down at a cellular level, even if our signs and symptoms are started to clear. So it's really about reminding ourselves of erring on the side of caution. And I think when speaking to young ones as well, it's can be helpful to talk about the fact that if we push ourselves too soon too early, what can happen is actually we make a recovery even longer. And that could mean that if we don't take it seriously and slow in that first period, we might actually take even longer to get back to sport than had we been, following the guidance, if that makes sense.
So one of the risks is basically you can make your recovery time a lot longer if you don't follow the pathway. What are
Yeah.
some of the other risks that can sometimes happen if you return or somebody returns too early, particularly for children and adolescents?
Yeah. So with that, I suppose if someone returns while symptomatic or has a concussion, so and ultimately if they've not followed, if in doubt, sit them out and they play on with concussion, there's a couple of things. One, they're at risk of picking up other injuries. So risk of musculoskeletal injury goes up. If you play on with concussion or there's some research that even after you've had a concussion, you're at risk within a period of time after that, which folk might not be aware of. So risk of other injuries like that, but also at risk of more severe catastrophic injuries. And I refer back to the very tragic case of Benjamin Robinson. So Benjamin Robinson sustained multiple concussions in a row and unfortunately passed away from something called second impact syndrome. Concussion can be fatal. And if we play on with concussion, we're at risk of potential injuries and in some cases more tragic ones.
And, there are obviously we're talking about what can happen after with regards to
Yeah.
concussion management, but symptoms, signs can symptoms in particular can sometimes differ for the likes of children,
Mhm.
female athletes, some athletes with disabilities.
Yeah. Yeah. As we said earlier, every concussion is unique. Every individual is unique. Um, no two concussions are the same. I've unfortunately had two, and although I'm the same person, they each looked very different. So it's, I think, really important to remember that. And I'm not an expert in sort of disability sport, but my understanding of the guidance and working with likes of Dr. Katie Mitchell in Canada. So if folk haven't come across her work, Thrive Neurosport, she does a lot of stuff with parasport and some guidance work there, and with females as well, so be worth looking at. But generally, there's this understanding that that type of audience might require a bit more time than that first 48 hours of relative rest, as an example. So there are definitely some instances where some populations might need some additional tweaks in addition to the general grass in response to what signs and symptoms come up for them.
Now, talking about multiple recurrent concussions,
Yeah.
how do you manage them in grassroots sports? Because I always say this, kids bounce, don't they? I mean, they literally go from one thing to the next. And, both my sisters have young boys, and I watch them try and just keep these kids safe during the day. And I think they must be exhausted, right?
Yeah.
How would a parent or a kind of a guardian manage multiple or recurrent concussions?
So the current advice at the moment is if someone picks up multiple concussions, particularly in a short period of time, the guidance is to seek support from a healthcare professional that's trained in concussion management. So that's sort of the key right now, because it might be that depending on the advice of that professional, they might depends on the case, but they might have advice to either sit out for a different period of time, try something a little different. I know some folk have tried different sports, because at the end of the day, I think a key is also we want to be keeping people active and involved in sport, but we want to do that in a way that is going to protect that brain health of that individual, right? So the advice with recurring or multiple concussions is to seek someone who has that training to guess be an ally and make sure that that brain is getting rehabilitated properly.
Yeah, and I think it is one of those things that, again, I still come back to the fact that sometimes I feel really uncomfortable. I'm like, I've
Mm.
got to make these decisions over someday, and I've been qualified a very long time, but I still find it almost that magnitude or that weight, especially knowing that you are dealing with a brain injury. It is one of those things. Now, looking ahead, what do you hope this guidance will achieve over the next 10 years? Because it sounds like it's actually done
Mm.
quite a bit over the last 10 years. So what are you hoping for over the next 10 years?
Yeah, so at the moment, I think the focus should be and is in fact in some of the work that I'm doing with Sport Scotland in schools, right? So this is a topic that I personally believe we need to be getting in earlier with individuals to really provide that foundation of culture change, starting folk early to help them appreciate how amazing their brain is, understanding that yes, concussion is a risk, but we have the guidance, we have a bit more understanding in pockets of how we might prevent concussion and how we can hopefully look after you so you maintain lifelong participation in sports. So I really think the priority should and needs to be in the schools, but also the medical professionals as well. And work. I know there's good pockets of work happening to look at upskilling so medical students and just trying to support some groups now that we've done things with PE cohorts, with teachers, with psychologists and stuff. Just continue to grow that, I think, is really key.
Yeah, I agree. Now, for our listeners, where can they find the guidance and resources? That would probably be a good question to ask. And also, where can they follow your work? Because you do a lot of great stuff with regards to concussion education. So, where can they find you?
Yeah, thank you. So, with regards to finding the Scottish Sports Concussion Guidance, if you pop that into Google, it should hopefully come up near the top of the search. But equally, if you go on the Sport Scotland website and search concussion, there is now a free e-learning module for anyone who wants to take part in that. It's a very short whistle-stop tour through the guidance. So that's available to folk, as well as the actual PDF of the guidance can be found on that webpage. In terms of the work that I do, both through concussED and sort of my honorary research roles as well. If folk want to follow on socials, it's at concuss_edu, so at concussEdu. I'm also on LinkedIn as well. So there's a couple of different places that folk can engage with what we're working on.
Yeah, and I would definitely recommend that you do because you're doing a lot of great stuff at the moment. Stephanie, it's been lovely to chat to you. I know you're very busy, so I'm going to let you go. For those of you listening, please always remember to follow the evidence. Please remember to follow those guidance. It's very important with anybody that has suffered a brain injury. And yeah, we will see you soon.
Thank you for listening to Women's Football Hub. The information within this podcast is for informational purposes only. No material on this podcast is intended to be a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please contact your doctor or another healthcare professional if you have any questions about anything raised in this podcast.